I've been researching World War II all of my life. Since I was about 6 years old, I have a special interest in the Pacific War. When I completed my undergraduate thesis at Fordham, Lincoln Center, now you can see it at worldwar2database.com, I found that a lot of photo captions were inaccurate or just downright wrong. I found that the most famous photos had stories behind them that were rich, and the people in the photos had really interesting lives. And I found that a lot of these photos went back and forth between Japan and the United States. I'm interested in Frank Capra's use of Nazi propaganda in Why We Fight. He took Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will and used it in American propaganda. These photos, created in either one country or the other, then appropriated by the other combatant, amount to a kind of dialogue between Japan and the United States while the war is going on. They're refusing to talk through diplomatic channels, but they're arguing in their own press about propaganda. And that's really fascinating to me, that they're arguing about specific battles or events through the medium of photography and film.
And then 7th, in the surprise assault, American warplanes were caught on the ground and bombed. Most of them were disabled.
This starts almost from the beginning. In the Pearl Harbor raid, the Americans and the Japanese had many filmmakers and photographers present. Each side used some of the same images to say different things about the war. They promoted their war aims using the same media. For the Japanese, their pilots were Sea Eagles, but for the Americans, they were just treacherous. How did this exchange take place? Japan took photos and they published them in their own magazine called Front. They gave copies to Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany published those photos in their magazine Signal. Copies of Signal magazine, the English language version, were purchased in Lisbon, Portugal by Life magazine's agents. And then Life magazine photographed the pages from Signal and published the photos in Life for the Americans. Famous Hollywood director John Ford made an American fictionalized version of the Pearl Harbor attack that was so lifelike, many documentary filmmakers still use it today, thinking it is actual footage of the attack. The Japanese government commissioned a film for public viewing of the attack from the Japanese point of view. Toho Studios, which would go on to make Godzilla after the war, was hired to create miniatures. In 1945, when the war ended, the Americans viewed the film and couldn't tell whether the miniature scenes were real or not. The attack on Pearl Harbor set the stage for the rest of the Pacific War, and through the exchange of different propaganda, the Americans and the Japanese were able to proclaim their goals for the war. The Bataan Death March would not be as easy as Pearl Harbor to document. First of all, it wasn't a public spectacle. Japanese photographers, led by Suguichi Koyanagi, took many pictures, but the Japanese government censored most of them. Filipino civilians took more graphic photos, most of them in secret, because if they were caught, they were executed. But the Filipinos sent their photos and other photos stolen from the Japanese to guerrillas hiding in the mountains of Luzon. The guerrillas sent all of these photos to the Americans via submarine. The Americans published the photos in Life magazine. Koyanagi and the other press and civilian Japanese photographers sent their photos to Japan. The Japanese government hid the photos from the public, except for pictures of Americans surrendering. They did not want people to see the atrocities that were committed. Some of them burned during the B-29 bombing, but all of the photos, the Filipino photos and the Japanese photos, were collected by the war crimes trials. All of these photos collected by the war crimes trials were used as evidence against the Japanese, especially Masaharu Hama, the commander of the Japanese army during the invasion in 1942. The Bataan Death March, like Pearl Harbor, shows that the Americans and the Japanese could look at the same photo, the same piece of film, and see two different reasons for its existence. They could see that these photos meant something to each nation that was different and unrelated. At the same time, the Bataan Death March was becoming public knowledge. An Arizona model named Natalie Nickerson was contracted by life photographer Ralph Crane to shoot a still life portrait. This image appeared in the May 22nd, 1944 issue of Life magazine. Readers were universally outraged at the appearance of such a war relic in the pages of Life. The Navy was very upset by the reaction to the photo. And even more upset was Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who urged the Army and the Navy to stop the collection of Japanese relics, such as skulls. The Japanese were horrified. In almost every medium, they talked about the photo, condemned the photo, and showed the photo to the Japanese public as an example of the horrible sensibilities of the Americans and Westerners. In the government magazine Weekly Photos, the Japanese published a heavily edited version of the photo, which made Natalie Nickerson seem more evil and destructive. They heavily criticized both Nickerson and President Roosevelt for allowing such relics to be collected. Domei, the Japanese government's English language radio service, said, "No one who calls himself a human being, much less a civilized human being, can read such reports without feeling the most profound indignation." Yomiuri Huchi News, in an editorial on August 4th, 1944, wrote, "These examples of American brutality are deeply rooted in the American character and are being fueled by a superiority complex in regard to East Asians. These bestialities are simply the most recent manifestations of a racist savagery which had victimized many others, including American Indians, Filipinos, African Americans, and Chinese. This aspect of American character is responsible for the murder of Japanese troops on Guadalcanal when wounded men had been deliberately crushed by tanks and tractors." Asahi Shimbun, on August 8, 1944, wrote the "Destroy This American Barbarism" editorial. In it, they said, "This is truly the picture in question that has starkly revealed true American barbarism of eating meat and sucking the marrow of bones. We, as Japanese, find it difficult to bear looking at. A prayer spontaneously wells from our hearts, a prayer of blessing for the spirit of that Japanese war dead." Lots of Americans collected Japanese skulls and other body parts during the war. Some American veterans have sought to return the relics to Japan for proper cremation or burial. Others believe that they are the property of their families and that they become cherished heirlooms passed down from father to children to their children. I'm not sure what this all means, but it's an interesting exploration of what the war meant, and it's certainly an expression of racism that characterized the Pacific War. As John Dower at MIT has written, "The Japanese were perceived as a race apart, even a species apart, an overpoweringly monolithic one at that. There was no counterpart to the good German in the popular consciousness of the Western Allies. At the same time, the Japanese dwelt at inordinate length on their own racial and cultural superiority, like their adversaries, who practiced discrimination while proclaiming they were fighting for democracy." I find all of these stories interesting, and there's probably others that I can pull together to make a coherent PhD thesis. However, for right now, I don't know if I should continue to focus on all three, or just one of these stories, or maybe two of these stories. There's possibly enough for a book on each story. It would have to be expanded beyond the scope of just one or two photos. It would have to be expanded to look at an overall topic.
No story has ever been written for time by any one single man or woman.
The other common thread in all of these stories is that the photos all appeared in Life magazine in one way or another. Either they started in Life or they ended up in Life magazine. So maybe my article should be about how propaganda came in and out of Life magazine, and Life magazine is a conduit between the Japanese and the Americans for the exchange of propaganda. Anyway, I've already completed a rough draft, and so this is more of a focus on editing what I have than trying to think of creating new topics for this specific semester. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.